In the recent season, anybody who has a prize to give for journalism usually gives it to two reporters for the Washington Post, Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward. It is they who, in June of 1972, were assigned the job of following the Watergate story and tracking down its implications, if any. They did so most doggedly, resulting in headline after headline, scoop after scoop, so much so that Watergate practically became a copyrighted story of Bernstein and Woodward. And now they have written about the case and the trails they followed and the risks they took in a book, All the President's Men, for which they have, it is said, been paid $500 million apiece, which is an improvement on the $15,000 apiece they were earning as incidental reporters of the Washington Post 2 years ago. They have a great deal to be grateful for. Bob Woodward is a Republican, or was anyway. He was born in Chicago, graduated from Yale in 1965, and then spent 5 years in the Navy as a communications officer. He did suburban journalism before joining the Post in 1971. Carl Bernstein was born in Washington. He attended the University of Maryland, but lost interest and dropped out, and went to work as a copy boy for the Washington Star, whence he drifted to the Post at age 19, joining the Metropolitan staff. The two reporters, interestingly enough, did not know each other well when they were assigned to the story, and apparently had professional misgivings about one another. I should like to begin by asking Mr. Bernstein whether he feels free to vouchsafe to us his feelings based on his familiarity with the case, on whether Mr. Nixon knew A, about Watergate, and then B, about the cover-up.
Well, all I think that we have to go on are the best evidence there, and neither of us is a judge. I think we can just make the same judgments as anyone else. Primarily the presidential tape recordings. On those recordings, there's no indication that the president had prior knowledge of the Watergate break-in. There are several statements that the president makes, both in the transcripts and in the additions to the transcripts provided by the House Judiciary Committee, where the president indicates some degree of knowledge of what's been called the cover-up. Now, whether or not that's illegal, I don't think that as reporters, we're really not jurors. We're in the business of trying to report, not make a judgment.
No, but you don't object to being impaneled, do you? Or do you?
I don't.
If you have misgivings about revealing what your own conclusions are, on the grounds that your own conclusions may be tendentious, I don't mind you saying that.
Well, I think that like anybody else, we have our own feelings. Yet, as reporters, I think we really prize our ability to detach ourselves in covering the story, and very much as a juror does. As a juror might have political beliefs or whatever. When he gets in a jury box, he really becomes a person who's interested in facts, not passions, in evidence.
Speaking of detachment, let me quote from your book, where you came in with a piece of evidence and you presented it to the boss, Ben Bradley. There was at least one witness, the book says, who could do some damage to Mitchell, Colson, Ehrlichman, and Dean. Bradley's eyes brightened. He did a little dance, holding an imaginary towel to his ass and wiggling it back and forth before walking off. Is that typical detachment in the Washington Post?
I think that in deciding to write this book, which is really not a Watergate book, but a book of journalism and how one newspaper worked on one story, we decided to tell all. And sometimes the exuberance of the moment, this was during a period after we had suffered really a series of attacks, very strident attacks by the White House, really denying our stories, calling us character assassins and practitioners of shoddy journalism, and we were very much on the defensive. Mm-hmm. And so he responded with a little towel to his ass.
That has to do more with our own credibility than taking any joy in the guilt of others or something like that.
Well, but there is a certain prosecutorial feel in the story, isn't there, that is by no means confined to the Washington Post. I detected sometimes in National Review's Washington correspondent.
Mr. Will?
George Will, who is a columnist for the Washington Post also. I don't think so. At least, as Carl was saying, we certainly have our feelings, but you quickly learn that in the newspaper business it does not serve your interest to put inaccurate information in the paper or information that has a political twist to it.
Yeah, I think when you talk about being prosecutorial, a prosecutor presents one side
That's
of
right.
a case, and only one side of
Yeah.
a case, whereas I think that throughout the Washington Post coverage, as well as other newspapers, that both sides of the case have been presented. I mean, anytime we put any kind of allegation in the paper, the first thing we do is go to the person who we're writing about and saying, you know, what about this? Is this right? And certainly there have been numerous occasions when people have told us, no, you're off base. Here's why. We've held back. We've kept it out of the paper. And indeed, if somebody, you know, can show us that we're wrong, we wouldn't put it in the paper.
Well, I understand that. And if, for instance, Deep Throat gave you a tape recording tomorrow, which absolutely established Nixon's innocence of the cover-up, you would certainly run it as a story.
Yes, indeed.
But there would be a general sense of deflation, wouldn't there?
No, I don't think so, because we try to spend as much time as we can talking to people in the White House, looking at their side of the story. Often the White House conversations about a certain allegation would consist of saying the sources of the Washington Post are a fountain of misinformation, and leave it at that, and they would go no further. Sometimes they will engage in a somewhat constructive dialogue, and we try to do that. And the story has gone way beyond what we ever really wrote, predicted, or had any notion of. And we have no real stake in an eventual outcome of establishing the guilt of the president.
You mean as individuals?
As
Well, as
individual, as an
reporters,
institution, I think the Washington
Reporting
Post
isn't
is one.
about that, establishing guilt.
Well, but when you hear people cheering and others booing when a particular jury verdict is handed down, as for instance with Stans and Mitchell a few weeks ago in New York City, you are reminded, are you not, that America tends to divide and finds itself urging certain verdicts. Now, the verdict of liberal America, where Nixon is concerned, is really that of a posse, it seems to me. The decision has been made that he's guilty. The decision hasn't yet been made that he must be convicted, but the decision has been made that he's guilty. And that decision has been made in part as a result of your contributions and in part as a result of his contributions. And I'm interested in the mixture.
Well, I can't speak for liberal America. I think, you know, you bring up a really good example when you talk about the Mitchell-Stans trial, and as if to think that maybe we were, you know, somehow deflated or something like that at the verdict. I think, to the contrary, if anything, the Mitchell-Stans verdict shows that the jury system works in this country, that the system works, that you can get a fair trial.
Well, now, what you're saying is rather formalistic, isn't it? Because the jury system works in the sense that it is conclusive, but it doesn't necessarily ascertain guilt or innocence.
No, it establishes that somebody can get a fair trial. I mean, Mr. Mitchell and Mr. Stans will not now say that they did not get a fair trial.
And it does establish legal guilt or innocence.
As I say.
And we're not
But not
arbiters
actual guilt
of-
or innocence.
Well, I think the press is not the arbiter of legal guilt or innocence. That's the job of the judiciary.
Oh. And I obviously I see the point that you make that's obvious, but the point that is less obvious is that the questions of guilt or innocence sometimes hang on non-justiciable data, and there's an awful lot of those that have accumulated.
Of legal guilt or innocence? Or are you talking
Well,
about
well,
just
even
people's
that.
perceptions?
Even that, the Supreme Court yesterday spent a great deal of time listening to somebody tell it that it had no authority to rule on a very important point, the resolution of which may or may not finally determine whether Mr. Nixon's guilty or innocent, right?
But you're talking about the metaphysics of guilt or innocence almost, aren't you?
No, the actuality of guilt or innocence.
But the system is established that will be determined by the jury, and then that's sort of
Or
it.
in the case of the President, the House and the Senate.
What I'm trying to say is, ought not to be that, ought not to be rather recondite, and I apologize for making it so. Let's go back to the other impeachment trial of Andrew Johnson. Concerning it, we know that there were very high passions, right? And John Kennedy included in his book Profiles in Courage a chapter in which he sang the praises of the deciding guy, Senator Ross, who said that Johnson was not guilty. He was hounded out of public life, and years later, Johnson was, quote, vindicated. Vindicated, curiously, as a result of a reading of the Constitution which he had very explicitly challenged. That was really a theoretical confrontation. This is a factual confrontation, isn't it? At least up to a point. There are theoretical issues having to do with executive security, and there are others that have to do with one factual reading of the case versus another reading of the case. What I'm suggesting to you is that there has been a blend of passion and investigation resulting in the effective trial of the president. That's
Well,
what I'm going
I don't think so.
No, you're talking about two different things. In terms of public opinion, the polls suggest that a majority of the people think that the president was involved in a crime. In terms of the system, in this case, the House of Representatives and the Senate, there has been no action taken yet, and the gears are sort of locked, and that mechanism will go forward. I think the point that needs to be made is that you alluded earlier to our contribution to Watergate and then Mr. Nixon's contribution to Watergate. And I think Mr. Nixon's contribution to Watergate is much more significant. On his tape recordings, which he turned over, he says things like the first day of his so-called Watergate investigation, he tells John Mitchell, I want you to stonewall it, and I want you to plead the Fifth Amendment. Now, that raises serious questions.
Right, so you do have these serious allegations against the president. I think that what we feel probably most strongly is one, that the system should work, that the president, as any other citizen, should be held accountable, but at the same time, like any other citizen, that the question of his impeachment or his possible conviction has got to turn on evidence, and that you have a jury, as it were, that's going to come in with a finding of guilt or innocence, and that decision should be based on what the evidence is, not on passion or gut, visceral feelings.
But don't you begin by acknowledging that it substantially won't, when you acknowledge that the vote for impeachment will be much heavier on the Democratic side of the ledger than on the Republican side? There ought to be no difference if it worked this way you describe it.
I think if you look at the process in the House Judiciary Committee, where they've labored for weeks listening to this evidence, which has been described by both sides as very tedious exercise, that they are trying to get the facts. Now, certainly they're political animals, and they're going to make political judgments, but I also think they're going to make evidentiary judgments. And particularly some of these so-called swing votes. I think these people are really impressed with the weight of the decision they have to make.
But they don't really know what the requisite conclusions are from a reading of the facts. Suppose it were established that Nixon did cover up. Do you believe that it follows from that he should be impeached?
Well, that's one of the questions. What you
Well,
seem
that's
to
right.
be...
It's a question,
Well,
isn't it?
the thing is that what is an impeachable offense is something that's rather undefined.
Yeah.
So there's not much law on it, there's not too much history on it, and really the House and the Senate are the judges of what impeachment shall be. I think that what we're terribly interested in is the process of disclosure, that we have to know what happened, why it happened, who was involved, how were they involved. Then you can make a finding.
But if there are ambiguities that issue from a concern for the national security, then precisely what we don't want is full disclosure from you, right?
Well, certainly if there's any legitimate national security issue that would arise, that either the House, the Senate, the Washington Post, the New York Times, really thought was a legitimate national security issue, I think that they would withhold that information. There have been occasions when
Notice he equates the House and the Senate
Right.
and is one branch of government, and
Right.
the Washington Post and the New York Times is another.
Well, what would be an example of a legitimate concern for the national security that you would just not?
Well,
We had
no,
one example
well,
that involved someone who supposedly was in the employ of a government security agency who was a spy, or supposedly was a spy spying on a foreign power, and that became known to us, and we obviously didn't print that or make any reference to it.
That's right. National security is a term that's been thrown around for 2 years in Watergate, and we find when you get down under the surface, there's very little national security and a great deal of embarrassment.
Right.
And in this one case that Carl cites, it eventually was published by both the Post and the New York Times in general terms.
Well, now this morning's papers carry accounts of an ex-CIA agent whose name is now revealed, and roughly speaking, what he proposes to reveal. And I think it's predictable that the Washington Post and the New York Times will carry digests of that. The reason I'm pursuing this line of inquiry is that it seems to me that the case of Nixon is spoken about formalistically as a case in which guilt or innocence hangs on the basis of the kind of data you have been collecting, but which, in fact, transcends, or if you prefer a less exalted word, is obliquely unrelated to
I don't think
these
that's
data.
the case. To the contrary, the case of the guilt or innocence of the president really hangs not on the data that we've collected, but on the data that the grand jury has collected, data which the grand jury found sufficient to name the president as an unindicted co-conspirator and say that he had participated in a criminal action. The grand jury certainly has a lot better access to information than we do, and that's really what the case is based on, not on what the Washington Post wrote or New York Times or Time Magazine or National
Well,
Review.
you did everything you could to get the grand jurors to speak to you, so that roughly speaking, you had equal access to information.
We describe that in the book.
Yeah, I do.
In this sort of, to stray over to that topic for a moment, that in writing how the process worked, we decided, it was really Carl's idea, that we had to strip ourselves bare and explain for the first time that we had contacted some grand jurors in an attempt to get information. We did not get any information from the grand jurors, and describe at some length in the book the process of that, and being called before Judge Sirica and not being named publicly as we expected, and then engaging in our own cover-up with our colleagues in the news media and refusing to identify ourselves as the unidentified members of the news media that Judge Sirica had alluded to in open court.
Well, you did.
But we got
The
no
point is, we
information.
did not have access to that information, and certainly the grand jury has, an awful lot more information than we have. I think that we were almost like writing about the tip of the iceberg.
Well, suppose a grand jury juror had volunteered to give you the minutes. You would gladly have accepted them, wouldn't you?
I think we now feel, and we describe in the book, that was an error going to grand jurors, and that we would not do it again. If somebody offered us the minutes, I don't know what we would do.
I certainly think we would
Call a
hesitate a
lawyer.
long time before we would print them.
Well, you did in fact say to the press things that were roughly comparable to what Ron Ziegler said to the press.
On that occasion, I mean, I think, there's really no excuse for what we did. We can make all kinds of things about why we did it. We were desperate at the time. It's true, we had written there was a cover-up, and we wanted to find out if the cover-up somehow extended to the grand jury, whether the grand jury had been manipulated. The fact remains that as we say in the book. It's something, you know, it was a very difficult problem. We decided what we were going to do. I think we made the wrong decision. I think that that we understand and believe in the secrecy of the grand jury, why it should remain inviolate. And we were just plain wrong.
Well, if you were managing editors of the Washington Post, would you, for instance, discontinue Jack Anderson's column where he regularly prints grand jury?
He doesn't regularly.
No,
there
he
was
did-
that
he can't get him
one-
for about
there
10
was
days.
that one
Irregularly.
period.
Irregularly.
For a 10-day period in 1973.
Yeah.
He printed minutes from the grand jury. I don't know. Again, I think those are terribly difficult questions, and I think this
I don't
is
mind
sort
difficult
of
questions.
one of the, and we're very. We're going to sound more like the White House
Right.
press secretary
Yeah,
in
really get
avoiding them.
Well, as a matter of fact, you are rather harsh on yourself. You refer to themselves in the third person in the book, but they had sailed around the law and exposed others to dangers. They had dodged, evaded, misrepresented, suggested, and intimidated, even if they had not lied outright. They had chosen expediency over principle, and caught in the act, their role had been cover-up. Now, there's nothing threatening you, is there, in the sense that there is threatening the president?
Not that we know of.
Not that you are. So that what is suggested is that there's a different ethic that obtains in your profession from that which should obtain in the political profession.
Meaning?
Meaning that you can do things and write best-selling books about them and give a rather chivalrous confession of excess, but nevertheless receive all the prizes, presumably because in part of those excesses.
That's a fair question.
Involved, yeah, it's very fair, but I think one thing is involved allegations of very serious criminal activity. And certainly had there come an occasion when if we had been accused of very serious criminal activity, I would think that we would be treated as anyone else who was accused of such.
Nobody is
But I don't think
accused
it's
us
true.
of committing crimes.
Who's going to jail for publishing illegally Nixon's tax returns? It's illegal. You're supposed to go to jail for it. Nobody did. Who did it
That
for
is not clear at
Who
all.
did it for Senator Dodd?
What the
Not
law
clear
is
at all.
on that it's...
Law says it's a criminal offense. I'm very sure what it says.
It's a criminal offense to disclose it.
That's right.
For
And-
an agent of disclosure to be someone in the IRS, I think, is a criminal offense.
That's
I would
right. They are
doubt
bound by.
very seriously that it's a criminal offense for someone to print it.
So you become surely guilty of
accessory or-
misprision of felony, a word we've all become very familiar with.
No, misprision involves having knowledge and not
And faith-
reporting
that's right.
it and not
That's right.
disclosing
And
it.
not-
They
yeah.
did disclose
So
it.
well, having knowledge of the agent of this crime, which was a disclosure, and not disclosing it, is something that journalists call not misprision of fallacy, but professional ethics.
Well, when it gets to disclosing sources, I think we have
Yeah.
a real problem about that. And,
But do you see the distinction between us not disclosing our sources and the president not disclosing what went on in those taped conversations in the White House?
Well, I think he was asked to disclose the taped conversations, and I think you probably do too. And this is not an ethical judgment I'm making. It's a matter of taste. I think that private conversations are awesomely private and ought to be. Besides, unless it's a soliloquy, you're involving somebody else. And to exercise dominion over somebody else's conversation and disclose it, I simply find heinous.
do you question whether or not, when you have allegations of criminal activity, that a court or a prosecutor has authority to obtain such information?
I think there is a hierarchy of considerations that all societies that choose to survive have got to attempt to construct. And one of them says, yes, under certain circumstances you can tape conversations. Under certain circumstances you can torture a guy who has the key to the H-bomb that's about to go off in central Philadelphia, that kind of stuff. But by and large, it seems to me that to tape other people's conversations and to reveal them ought to be recognized by the law as what I judge it to be morally a heinous offense.
But now,
And I think one of the worst
tape
things Nixon ever
recordings-
did was to reveal. I think that Nixon ought to have burnt the tapes instantly.
but they
and
now
publicly.
exist
4th
in-
of July, preferably.
Right. But the tapes now exist,
Yeah.
and the question is what to do with them. And many people will say, well, you're doing what Nixon is doing with the sources, but there's been no allegation, and there's no suggestion, I don't believe, that the disclosure of information to us by confidential sources involved a crime. And so we are protecting that.
Well,
Is it under the First Amendment, if that...
It depends obviously on the quality of the information passed along, right? There is a law that forbids me from giving you certain kinds of security information that I'm entitled to and you're not, right?
Correct.
So if I do that, I'm breaking the law.
If you're talking now about espionage, the espionage statutes, I don't think anybody's run into the espionage statutes in Watergate. Nothing close to
No,
it.
but it's not on the result of any obvious sense of restraint.
Oh, I think, when it comes to espionage, that there would be tremendous sense of restraint on the part of the press, on the part of people in the security agencies. I don't think espionage is something that most people take very lightly.
I think it's a thing that most people take extremely lightly. All kinds of operettas were written to the tribute of people who committed or tried to commit espionage during the Vietnam War. I think that the whole notion of the individual conscience triumphant in matters of public policy happens to be very fashionable right now. So that I doubt that there would be. Or what do you call it when you publish the fallback position on SALT I? Or what do you call it when you publish the secret meetings of the National Security Council during the Bangladesh-India confrontation?
You call it disclosure, good reporting.
I think on SALT,
you
it's
people are very
very
good at finding euphemisms.
Well, the SALT thing is really a
No, what I call
fascinating
this-
example. There's a fine book written on SALT, and I think you'll find that one of the primary sources of information for that book, which is sort of the definitive work on the subject, is the Secretary of State, Mr. Kissinger, and that book was written very much with his cooperation. So I don't,
Which he denies, by the way.
he's denied that he
Yes,
had anything
yes,
to do
yes.
with those articles in the New Yorker. I didn't realize that, but that's surprising.
What you're talking about is sort of this Ellsberg obsession, really,
Yeah.
isn't it? That sort of, we get lots of people ask us that, sort of, why are we worrying about the president when Ellsberg is loose? And there's the, I mean, am I right? I mean, you're worried about
No, I
that.
should think
You're
you could worry about them
deeply-
simultaneously. but go ahead and do it your way.
But we get many questions, and the law operated on Mr. Ellsberg, and simultaneously with the law operating on him were the White House plumbers, and the case against him was dismissed because the judge ruled that there had been misconduct. Now, we can't pass judgment on that the process is over. Same with Nixon, but I find a terrible strain there. That why can't we get Ellsberg back in the picture?
Right,
here? Why
and when
can't-
certainly
Well, no.
Mr. Ellsberg was prosecuted, and then some.
There's an obvious answer to your question, I think, which is that this was an unconsummated trial, and under the circumstances, we are left not knowing what the verdict would have been, and under the circumstances, we are left without a court decision on that kind of
On
activity.
the merits.
That's right.
But you...
Ellsberg was surrounded by attorneys, $1 million worth of attorneys, who insisted that what he did was okay. That's why when you say that we should all react in horror to the word espionage, I say on the contrary, not very many people do, because espionage has become something that was last committed by Cox's army.
Well,
for
the
what it's
one
worth,
thing is
we
you
do
had...
react seriously.
Well, but
to
also in the
espionage.
Ellsberg case, you had the Pentagon Papers case in which the courts found that espionage was not involved in the disclosure of that information. There was one or two pieces of information which, at the request of the courts and the Pentagon, was deleted from what the Washington Post and the New York Times published. There were never any allegations of espionage involved in that case against the press.
No, I was talking about Ellsberg.
I don't even think Ellsberg was accused of espionage, as a matter of fact. I don't think that was ever the charge against him. But again, the system had a chance to work in Mr. Ellsberg's case, and I think that's the important thing.
The system didn't have a chance to work.
To the contrary.
The system was aborted by a completely extrinsic happening, which was the approach by Ehrlichman to the presiding judge.
Well, it was more than that. There
It
was some
was the
wiretaps involved. There was serious governmental misconduct, and the system is such that you're afforded certain rights and protections if you're a defendant in a criminal case, and there are very often cases that don't go on the merits, but rather go on procedural issues or on questions of governmental conduct. I think that's perfectly proper. I mean, that's really what the system is all about, why it works. Same reason Mitchell Stands worked.
The professor of law has written that it takes a high toleration of irrationality in America to put up with a system in which, if it is established that one person is guilty, you send him to jail. If it is established that a second person is guilty with the prosecution, you exonerate them both. This is exactly what happened in the Ellsberg case.
At least we were right about you do have that obsession with Ellsberg. You're deeply worried about him.
No, I go weeks without thinking about it.
We couldn't tell.
The only thing
Must have had a rough day.
the only thing I reject is the notion that I should personally come to a conclusion harmonious with Judge Burns on the matter of whether he was guilty.
Sure. Well, it's just like, I mean, then you're going to get into the problem that if the House Judiciary Committee decides not to recommend impeachment of the president, then are you going to say the system aborted because maybe you would not agree with the 38 members of that committee?
No, I would say it aborted as regards that point. And one of the arguments that's being used, as you are aware, primarily by people like Father Drinan, is that unless Nixon is impeached by the House, we are in effect going to ratify that kind of conduct in future presidents. So there's a sense in which there's going to be a dreadful case of coitus interruptus if Nixon is not, in fact...
Do you agree with that, or...?
Absolutely, I agree.
You do.
But I'm not saying that the whole purpose of American history is to relieve me of such frustrations as I would otherwise have to assimilate. It may be that I'll have to go to my grave wondering whether Nixon was constitutionally correct in bombing Cambodia. Well, maybe I'll just have to do that.
I now see for the first time why they call you the Thomas Aquinas of the 20th century.
No, he had answers to everything. Thomas Aquinas went to his grave without any doubts at all about anything. But speaking of doubts, you do then feel some doubts about your own activity. Well, you've expressed that. I don't want to.
Well, there certainly were occasions when that we did things that raised serious ethical problems, and we had to call them one at a time. And on several occasions, we did some things I think we wouldn't do again.
You were going to defy your subpoenas, as I remember.
We weren't.
You were going to
fight them.
You were going to hide the evidence and do all those things that.
No,
we so saw Nixon for doing.
I don't think we were going to hide any evidence. I think what we did was we went into court with a motion to quash, and we won.
Well, it said if necessary, Mrs. Graham would have to go to jail.
Yes.
Well, that's very true. I think we feel very strongly about the disclosure of sources of confidential information.
And so does Nixon.
Yeah.
Indeed, he obviously does.
And the question is, what is the appropriate penalty?
Well, the question is, what is the difference? First of all, that there are allegations that he was engaged in criminal conduct.
Right.
There are no allegations by anyone, I guess, unless you want to bring them against us, that we were involved in
a criminal conspiracy.
Well, let me quote your own lawyer. Edward Bennett Williams said, quotes, "We had a lot to do convincing those people to keep your asses out of jail."
That's involves the grand jury. Now you're shifting
That's right.
now.
That's right.
Which is he presented, I think he talked with Judge Sirica about it. Judge Sirica was disturbed. He called us into court and read us out.
We're
and I
not,
guess
we're not
concluded,
lawyers, but I don't think that we were guilty of violating the law in that instance.
He was sort of your milk lobby in this situation, wasn't he?
who was?
I'm not saying that he promised to do anything in return to Judge Sirica, but it was a close thing, wasn't it?
Well, we
we
were pretty
don't know.
worried about it.
We don't
It's,
know.
You know, Judge Sirica can be a little unpredictable. He's a pretty tough judge, as we've seen.
I think the point that comes out of this, and it's really what the book is about, and that is the sort of the imperfect process of journalism, that you do operate on the 24-hour cycle in our case, that you catch history on the run, and you make mistakes, you make errors in judgment, but that it's done with or it's attempted to be done with an integrity, that the biggest doubters in Watergate to a certain extent were ourselves when we were told these things, whether it be in the recesses of an underground garage at night or sitting over coffee with somebody or the telephone. We were the biggest disbelievers. We couldn't imagine that this had gone on.
And that's why we used what we called the two-source rule, that unless we had confirmation of an allegation by two independent sources from really different avenues, which is to say maybe an investigator and somebody from the White House or somebody from the Committee for the Re-election of the President in the White House, we would never even consider putting it in the paper because the things we were finding out were so astounding that we'd run off into the coffee room and say, how could this be? It couldn't happen.
And on the occasional times that you made errors, as for instance on the Haldeman testimony, there was genuine consternation, wasn't there?
We actually considered resigning from the newspaper. This is an instance in which we said that H.R. Haldeman, then the President's Chief of Staff, had controlled these secret funds at the White House and the Committee for the Re-election of the President. Part of the attribution was in error, saying that somebody had testified to this before the grand jury. In fact, the person had not, but the story was true.
The substance of the story was absolutely
unfair
correct.
to Mr. Haldeman. At one point, we considered that we were going to have to, besides perhaps resigning from the paper, apologize to Mr. Haldeman.
The only people that really suffered from that were us. And we thought our credibility was completely undermined by that. Stories had been sort of building, and there was a logical progression to them, and then all of a sudden, we had really tripped up.
During these periods of doubt, it would have been great if we could have consulted you on a treatise on human nature and realized that this was all possible, because to us, in a way, it was impossible. There was sort of a reverence for the presidency and the White House that it took us aback.
Well, that's an extremely interesting comment. This was a reverence inculcated, I guess, in your case, by history courses at Yale. No, I'm asking seriously. Was it,
It's a good thing I went to those public schools.
That's right. No, I think it's sort of. I think it's something that Carl shared with me. Different as our backgrounds
covering
are.
Washington. I mean, you don't expect the type of activity that we were writing about to occur in the White House.
Do you do distinguish between reverence and awe?
I think we even, like any citizens, you have some awe of the presidency, especially as it's become a more powerful institution.
Well, I would have awe of, say, Stalin, but no reverence. And this is a distinction I think that one ought to make. And as regards the American president, it seems to me that even pre-Woodward and Bernstein, there was enough investigative journalism to suggest inappropriate skepticism.
I think
about a lot of presidents, at least a lot about some of the crap that they.
Yeah, but again, you'd never
magnitude.
run into anything that I can think of like a criminal conspiracy to obstruct justice that occurred in the White House. I really can't think of any instance in history where that's
Well, what about
before.
a criminal conspiracy to suspend the Constitution? We've had several of those. Like suspending habeas corpus by Lincoln, like suspending the Constitution by the Louisiana Purchase.
Like
suspending whatever the hell we had to suspend to move all those Japanese from California into Utah.
There's certainly been isolated incidents,
Well,
throughout
isolated.
history.
I'm glad they're isolated, but it seems
But this
to me
has
that
to
they,
do
that
with
they
something else.
assume the proportions of Mount Rushmore compared to this kind of stuff.
But
Well,
does that mean
I
that we
think that
shouldn't
the proportions of
examine
this
this
are
one?
like
Not at all. Not
Mount
at all.
Rushmore. That's the point of Watergate, that nothing has happened like this on this scale with this kind of intensity and scope.
My feeling is that Nixon contributed to this uniquely. What gives Watergate its proportions, my own judgment is the transfusion into it of that special self-serving moralistic rhetoric of the President of the United States. If he had been a little bit more suave about it, a little bit less pompously innocent,
Are you saying
it would have been accepted. I think it's pretty workaday.
Doesn't it have to do with how he viewed power, or how the people around him viewed power? That it is.
I don't think so, and I think that you see that yourself. That there was never any suggestion that Watergate was going to lead to American fascism, or there was never any schematic attempt to accumulate power
for its own sake,
that
it was essentially defensive.
It was not a proto-fascist
I agree
part at
with
all.
that. Yes,
It
completely.
was a completely spontaneous arrangement to try to
get
George McGovern nominated.
No, but if you put it all together, you see over the 4 years of the first Nixon administration, a penchant for secret activity, as one of our sources told us. If there was an open way to do something and a secret way to do something, and they would both achieve the same result, they would choose the secret
But Johnson
way.
was exactly the same way.
Well,
Lyndon Johnson
but you always
changed his mind about who to appoint to the cabinet several times.
That's
simply
very true,
because
but
people like you would
again,
leak it.
the different.
No, we would.
You're
we'd
not
be the
equating. You're
recipients.
equating apples and oranges here. We're now talking about people in the White House who were seem to have been willing, for one reason or another, to suspend a lot of constitutional protections, to break the law, to take the very integrity of the judicial process and subvert it, of the electoral process and subvert it. This was kind of a wholesale thing. This was no isolated little corner.
No, but he's right when he says it was not schematic. In the
No,
sense
it's
that
certainly that it being preconceived that in 1968 or 69, a bunch of people sat down and said, we're going to create a crypto-fascist state.
Yeah,
I agree with you.
or we're going to. Some of the attempts failed as a result of clumsiness. There was an enemies
Most definitely.
list. There was an enemies list.
But
and there
not a
was
very
decision
good
to
one.
maximize
Right.
the incumbents.
Yeah.
But fortunately, when they went to IRS and people to cooperate, they just laughed at them.
Yeah, well, there's that point in the transcripts where I guess it's Haldeman, the White House Chief of Staff, says to the President that we just can't get away with anything, that we always seem to get caught. And there was a particular, after Watergate anyhow, a particular penchant that seemed to lean in that direction.
But it springs from the same mentality. In other words, once you lay it all out, if you came from Mars and looked at it, you would say, this could have been schematic. It wasn't, I agree with you. But it could have been. When they decided to investigate Teddy Kennedy, or when they brought Tony Ulasewicz and Jack Caulfield to the White House staff to act as secret investigators, looking at those great security
in that case,
threats.
they would try to take over the role of the press.
Mary
weren't they?
Jo Kopechne.
And the Smothers brothers, one
Right.
certainly.
Right. Back to the national security on CBS.
As I say, they were trying to usurp the responsibilities of the press. Miss Leslie Bennett is a reporter with the Philadelphia Bulletin. Miss Bennett?
On a more personal level, the two of you have received a great deal of personal notoriety as a result of the book and the investigation, and I gather that Robert Redford is going to make a movie about you. I'd be interested in knowing how your lives have changed because of all of this publicity, how people who have known you before react, whether they react to you differently, how people you're meeting for the first time react to you, and how much all of the notoriety has impaired your functioning as regular reporters on the staff of a newspaper.
Do you want to
One
answer
what?
the first five?
Right, I think
One what?
The second
they're
five?
all kind of related. I think for a reporter, reporters have a congenital discomfort about becoming a part of a story or being involved in a story, especially one that they're covering. And I think we share that. It's much more comfortable to be on the other side of the notebook, and that's what we're used to, and I think that's where we prefer being. At the same time, I think that, you know, we have written a book that certainly we demand disclosure of other people, that we ask other people questions. I think we feel that we ought to be subjected to the same process.
Yes, but only insofar as your professional work is concerned.
No.
And I'm here to protect you
Yeah.
against questions of that kind, which in fact I make it a point of not asking.
Do you have questions about our personal lives
No.
that you'd like to ask?
No.
That you're restraining yourself on?
No, if you were running for public office, then I would say yes. I would be entitled to ask you.
Oh, I think you're entitled to ask anything.
Well, I don't.
Right. Here's the chance.
Please feel.
I'm surprised that you think that you. I don't see that I have any right to ask you what you had for breakfast this morning. If I had a kooky curiosity about it, I think my right, primarily, I should be invited to suppress it, not to gratify it.
Well, and this is a danger, we've set ourselves up in a position of writing about other people's misdeeds, and we have to, as we describe in the book. There was one point when Ben Bradley, the boss, called us in the office. Instead of wiggling his ass around an imaginary towel, he said, if there's anything in your life that is bad, you've got to...
Now is the time
now
to cut
is
it
the
out.
time to cut it out.
Because,
And,
get a lawyer to do your taxes, et cetera. Watch, who you say.
and that's an
Yeah,
awkward
but
position.
Yes, but that was once again said for reasons of professional caution,
Right.
i.e., so that somebody couldn't exercise a blackmailer's leverage on you, right?
I would tend to agree with you that it really is irrelevant. At the same time, I think that we feel we should answer those questions. That's all.
Well, perhaps as a matter of courtesy, you feel you want to answer, but I don't think that you're required to answer them, and you're not required to answer them on this program.
That's very kind. Did we answer it?
To answer the second half of her question, which is, obviously this has changed our lives a great deal, and what it means or how it shakes out, we don't know. We're anxious to get back to reporting. We canceled 19 or 18 interviews this week in order to get back and do that.
Including this once.
Including this once.
And almost twice.
And almost twice. But then you blackmailed us by saying, I'll reveal what you had for breakfast.
I bought a new bicycle.
I called them up on the telephone. I said, "This is Deep Throat. Go."
The
Mr.
Oxford branch.
Aha. So he's has an American Middle Western twang, does he?
Talks like Mel Brooks.
Mr. Michael Schechtman. Schechtman is a law student at Villanova. Mr. Schechtman?
Yes, Mr. Buckley, pardon me. You have mentioned Deep Throat, and we've talked about other unidentified White House sources. Gentlemen such as Mr. Bridges and Mr. Farr have been jailed and found in contempt of court. You were confronted with a similar situation and won on your motion to quash. If you had lost, would you have been prepared to go to jail rather than reveal your sources?
Yes, unquestionably.
We had a strategy whereby we would give our notes to Mrs. Graham, who is the publisher of the Washington Post, and really one of the finest ladies I think both of us have ever met. And we figured then they would have to send her to jail, and that
we were going to visit and bring food. And
in the picture of her
Think of the first
limousine.
edition.
That's right. The picture of her limousine pulling up to the woman's detention center would probably run in every newspaper.
actually, we were going to keep part of the notes, so there would have been joint responsibility. But yes, I think very definitely we were prepared to if we had to.
Well, do you feel a historian's sense of obligation by keeping these papers? I mean, is there written down somewhere the name of Deep Throat?
We just don't go into
You just memorize
sources
it
at all.
You
We
just
don't.
memorize it, can't you?
We just wouldn't
We
go
wouldn't
into
that.
anything.
So you
we
have-
haven't
Like
decided
breakfast,
yet
it's off
whether we're going
limits.
to donate the papers to the Nixon Library.
Depends on whether the law changes. Ms. Deborah Willig is the president of the Student Bar Association of Temple Law School. Ms. Willig?
Yes, I would like to ask you, in a recent newspaper column, Arlene Lotman, the executive director of the Pennsylvania Commission on the Status of Women, posited the theory that if more women had been in the upper echelons of government and politics, activities such as Watergate wouldn't have happened. It was her theory that women are not presently in American society in positions of financial power in corporate management or unions or lobby groups, and therefore they wouldn't be likely targets for bribery or extortion, etc., because they have no influence to peddle. I was wondering, from your experiences on the Washington political scene, would you comment on that?
One of the really interesting things that, in fact, one reviewer, I guess we never realized it ourselves, one reviewer noted how many of our sources, especially at the beginning, were women. They were secretaries, clerical workers, accountants, bookkeepers. There's a long scene in the book about
But it would be
about a
terribly
bookkeeper.
sexist to suggest that there is a
Right.
repository of honesty which exists in the female that is not
Absent-
comparable to that of the
absent
male.
Right.
And to even hint at that would
No,
be...
I'm not saying that there's a higher moral value among women, although a recent Stanford study does seem to show that. What I'm saying is that women aren't in
always
positions.
getting in a plug.
No, I'm saying that women aren't in positions at the present time to be able to, peddle the influence that men can peddle because of their positions in corporate
But there was
unions.
very little blackmail in Watergate. There was an attempt at it, allegedly an attempt at blackmail, but that's the only instance that we know of.
Certainly there have not been a lot of women in
Well, we know
positions
that.
occupied by Haldeman, Ehrlichman, Colson, Dean, etc. That point is correct.
Yeah, it seems to be the answer to the question is obviously yes, that she's correct. If you don't exercise power, you don't become the object of the affections of somebody who wants that power exercised.
Well, unless you're in a position to...
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
If the president hadn't the authority to affect milk prices, he would be less the idol of the milk industry, right?
Right.
But are you going beyond that?
Well, I was wondering if you see a reason or even a movement in Washington politics to have more women in the upper echelons.
I think there's a lot of tokenism, really, and that's too bad. I think that it should be a more legitimate, direct effort, and I think very frequently that's lacking and saddening.
But things are changing. I mean, I think there has been tremendous progress made, but certainly there still is too much tokenism. But you don't, even now, we don't see in the White House or on the Supreme Court.
Or at the Washington Post.
Well, because you work in a
That was my next
gynocracy anyway. So you hardly have to. I mean, after all, they just finished saying that the boss lady of their own outfit is a lady, usually.
Indeed. Oh, indeed. There's an incident in the book where John Mitchell is talking to Carl and
Right.
says that if you publish this story about Mitchell's involvement in the secret fund, Katie Graham is going to get her, and I guess we better delete it.
Caught in a ringer.
Caught in a ringer. And
The next day, I came in to the office, and we put that in the paper, what Mitchell said. And Mrs. Graham came up to me, and she said, "Do you have any more messages for me, Carl?"
and then she bought a steel brassiere, and we continued publishing the story.
Miss Bennett, do you have another question?
Well, I'm interested.
You don't think we still answered it, right?
No, I really
Right.
don't.
Okay, try another part of it.
You're functioning as journalists. Are you going to be going back to the Washington Post to be, metropolitan city reporters?
We're still working on the story, and we're still on the Metropolitan
But you've been on a
staff.
publicity tour, I gather, for the book.
For 2 weeks we went out, yeah,
What are your future plans
to be reporters for the Washington
as
Post.
reporters? Will you be assigned to any particular area? Or?
I think we got to finish this story first.
There are a number of things we'd like to work on. We get many suggestions from people, many of whom will write in and say, why not look at Chappaquiddick? If you go back and look at the Washington Post reporting on Chappaquiddick, it was really some of the toughest. Then there are the inevitable calls coming from people who say, I have a story that's bigger than Watergate. And they go on to describe how their father's Social Security check has been late 5 months in a row. And they wonder if Mr. Buckley's friend Howard Hunt had anything to do with it.
We're going to cover the Knicks.
What did you discover? Mr. Scheckman?
Yes, many commentators on the American scene have said that the impeachment process that we are deeply enmeshed in is antiquated and have recommended a change to the parliamentary vote of no confidence. Do you gentlemen feel this would be healthy And would it change the operation of the Chief Executive's office?
Well, the first thing is it'd be a little presumptuous for us to pretend that we're political scientists or anything of the kind. I think what we're seeing now is really a test of the system and whether it works. Let's wait and see what happens. It is just my own personal feeling, and see if it works. I certainly think that the system over, the history of the country has worked pretty well. I'd be very hesitant to start changing something as basic as that and go to a parliamentary system. That's got nothing to do with my being a reporter on Watergate.
But regardless of an outcome, we are deeply bogged down in this, and it is taking a rather lengthy time, whereas a vote of no confidence is a rapid system.
Any pursuit of the truth or trying to set in motion a process of fairness is inevitably a prolonged unraveling, and I think that this impatience with it, very, very understandable. People will say to us, why don't you stop writing about this? Why don't we get over with Watergate? But
get off his back.
We sort of are in a posture now where I think in terms of the system, your question and others about the system, that we really can't stand not to know what happened. And that's not simple. And it's painful. We understand, but the idea that we're so bogged down that excuse me, that things can't work, I think, is incorrect.
Do you care to make a prediction, or do you think that there's too much evidence still to be assimilated?
You mean on whether he'll be impeached or convicted? I think, everybody learned a long time ago not to try and predict what's going to happen in Watergate. You're always surprised at every turn. Certainly there's a large body of evidence that the grand jury forwarded, found reason to name the president an unindicted co-conspirator that has yet to really be dealt with. And there's still some things we don't know that we have to know. At the same time, I guess we feel very strongly, whatever feelings that we might have about, we can make a judgment like anyone else about what the evidence shows so far, but what we're really interested in is that this thing not turn on passion at this point.
Thank you, Mr. Bernstein. Thank you, Ms. Woodward. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen of the panel. Thank you all.
Bound copy of this program, send 50 cents to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. That's 50 cents to Firing Line, Post Office Box 5966, Columbia, South Carolina 29250. Production funding provided by public television stations, the Ford Foundation, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.